This is Python's Paradise. This is your host, Greg Gilbert, aka the Python Hyena, straight out of Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, but rocking a beautiful Toronto background behind me because I consider that my real home. I love Toronto. But you know what? We're going outside of North America today. Yes, right into the UK, but we are talking about some Canadian stuff, though. Folks, I don't remember when I reached out to this guy, but it was quite a few years ago. And I'm one of these fellas, when somebody gets hold of me, whether it's a few years later or not, I always take them in. Because with online social media like Facebook, I never know when people get messages. So the door is always open. And when this fellow got back to me, I was like, wow, okay, been a while since I sent that. But the answer was yes, definitely come on the show. Folks, he is the director of Tech Shelter Terrors and also the author of 100 cult movies. Folks, I give you the awesome Xavier Mendik. How do you do, Xavier?
Hi, Greg. I'm fine. Thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, don't trust social media for messaging, I guess is the kind of is the wraparound from this. So I'm just really glad we connected. And sorry once again that messaging didn't help us.
That's okay. No worries. It's funny because your film Text Shelter Terror kind of got my attention because I was born in 1972 when right around when this stuff was starting to come together and of course speaking of Canada, I'm wearing a class of 1984 shirt here, and that is my friend Lisa Langlois on the
Of
shirt.
course.
Lisa is I've lived here my whole life, and I'm about to do my fourth convention with Lisa. So she invited me to Toronto back in 2017 to assist her at Horrorama. And of course, a year or two prior, they screened apparently Tax Shelter Terror. I wasn't there that year, but I adventured for the first time. I'm going to be 52 this summer. So I never ventured out of the pro or even out of New Brunswick until Lisa invited me to a sister. So it was my first time on a plane, my first time on a subway, my first time doing a lot of things. And so I've done three conventions with Lisa, and I'm about to do my first one in the US with her at the end of April. So quite excited about that. And class of 1984. I is I'm gonna call it my favorite Canadian film. I love
Mm.
that film. I grew up with it, and very happy to have made a friend out of her. So that kind
Yeah,
of got,
and
yeah,
yeah, sorry, and I was going to say before we move on, a big shout out to Horror Army because, as you say, I think that was the worldwide premiere of Tax Shelter Terrors before it actually went on to the festival circuit. So we owe them a great deal. I wasn't there for that actual screening, but I believe some of the original folks from Cinepix were there, and I believe even the late Diane Thorne was there. So it was a really wonderful constellation of people who came together to celebrate the best in Canadian culture. So I'm sure you'll enjoy the upcoming event, but a big shout out to the folks there because they gave us a break that we really needed, and we're very grateful.
yeah. I love Horrorama. I've done 2017, 18, 19, and I think what was it, 2020? I've done four of them. I know there was, of course, during the pandemic they didn't have it, and last year they didn't have it because it's a smaller one, but it's one that's endearing to me because I always loved that event and I've done a couple of Frightmare. No, I've done three Frightmare in the Falls, one Toronto Comic Con, and I'm about to do Chiller in New Jersey with Lisa. knock on wood at my eye heels. I had an eye operation back January 30th because I had a torn retina. So um, it's certainly getting better. I'm just hoping it's better enough for me to fly at the end of April. So I can assist Lisa at this. But nonetheless, um, quite excited to have you on here and talk about this. And I know you had a new one on here too because you had sent me the link and I watched that as well. So absolutely perfect. So
Yeah, that was the Quiet Revolution, which was a follow-up documentary again on Canadian horror cinema. So I mean, yeah, there was. It's interesting. It's interesting to see how Canadians respond to their own culture, number one, and secondly,
mhm.
how fascinated folks are around the world about all of these amazing films that are still coming out of Canada, but particularly in the 1970s, that was the golden era of what is often referred to as can exploitation, Canadian cult exploitation and horror cinema. So there's just a wealth of talent there that really needs to be put on the map.
And of course, the new one is called The Quiet Revolution, State, Society, and the Canadian Film. You got a part one, you got a part two, and I appreciate you sending that to me, so I was able to check that out. And it was fun going through that, and looking at some of these footage of some of these films, and I've definitely had some people from these films on the show, like Lynn Lowry's been on from Shivers, and I've got a ton of autograph stuff from her here because I met her at Horrorama 2018. I've had Cindy Hines on here from The Brood, and
Mm.
yep, she's a lovely soul, who've gotten to know a little bit as well. So, but I remember watching Tax Shelter Terrors. Speaking of Tax Shelter Terrors, this is my terror. This is Skittles. Skittles? Did you want to co-host with me on here? Do you have a kitty?
We have a dog here in the UK, a sort of a rescue dog. So
Skittles is
he's the
offended.
mascot. He's the mascot for us.
Skittles is offended. He hears dog and he's like, oh, he's offended. That is my buddy Skittles. Went over here to I always stick him on here whenever he comes over. I've done quite a few interviews with people out of the UK, and I think the first one that comes to mind was I've done three tributes on Ray Harryhausen, and I've had somebody that worked closely with him on here when Clash of the Titans had its anniversary. But and I've done a number of others as well. But the tax shelter terrors, I don't even remember how I come across it. All I know is that it caught my attention because it's unfortunate that we don't have this anymore, And
Mm.
one of the things that's always annoyed me is that we got films that are shot in Canada, but because they're funded in the States, they're not called Canadian films, like Mean Girls and Deadpool and movies like that, shot right up here. And it's like, it's like because it's funded in the U.S., it doesn't get counted. And
Yeah.
despite U.S. involvement, I still consider Class of 1984 and Porky's both Canadian film.
Absolutely, and I think it's like a double-edged sword here. So you have a number of films that are shot in Canada, and maybe because of US funding or US crew, their status as Canadian films becomes question marked or sort of controversial. And then you have these horror movies that were Canadian products funded by either private investment schemes, controversially funded by private investment schemes, or even more controversially funded by the Canadian government to kickstart the industry. And then they're seen as genre text or controversial films or exploitation films or horror films, and so they get shunned and they're equally not Canadian. So these films are a fascinating vessel of how Canadian society was trying to deal with its own images in a way.
Mhm.
And I guess, here I am, as you said, Greg, sitting in the UK. So an English director working with Canadian crew did this, and that's a great honor for me. But again, it's testament really as to why did it take that, if that makes sense. For Tax Shelter Terrors, could have been a purely Canadian project, but it wasn't, And so I think there's still a number of challenges around how Canadian cinema is viewed, particularly Canadian horror cinema. But those challenges often mask just the wealth of talent and creativity that's happening, in Canada. And that's really what we wanted to do with Tax Shelter Terrors, was to just document these really important films and the talents behind them.
Before we get into your involvement with that, I would like to get a little bit of your background and not only how you got into the business, but what led you to take interest in this particular subject, like the tax shelter film situation?
It's a really interesting question, and this sounds really weird. For Christmas, my wife bought me, and you're not far off the age I am, so this probably will register with you. She got me a Betamax video recorder, right,
Oh yeah.
to relive my youth, and so it wasn't working, and I sent it off to be repaired to this wonderful guy on YouTube called Mr. Betabyte, and he restores video recorders, and he asked me to send him a resume that he could read out while he was repairing it, of why this was important, why I wanted it repaired. And I sort of basically said, well, I grew up in the 1980s in a single parent household. The video boom was just emerging. My grandmother and my mother saved for over a year, and I put all my pocket money aside to buy this Betamax video. So my wife's bought me the same model I had as a teenager, and of course, the first thing I did was go out and watch all of these amazing horror and exploitation films I hadn't been able to watch before. We only had a black and white TV at the time, so a lot of them looked even more shocking in monochrome, and that really just kick-started my fascination with these movies. And then I started writing about them for fanzines. Then I went off and did a studied film. Flash forward all these years later, I'm one of two professors of cult film in the world. The other is in Canada. Isn't that interesting? Professor Ernest Mateus, and I work with Ernest a great deal. So it's been there as a long-term project to always look at horror films. And I guess what film studies did is it gave me a toolkit to look under the bonnet. So for all those people who were dismissing these movies, I'd start to look at the social or the cultural or the political context. So what drew me to Tax Shelter Terrors was the films themselves, was also the fact that there was a lot of kind of quite challenging and toxic stuff going on in Canada in the 1970s at the same time that these films were being made. And it's almost like, that these films really harnessed changing social and gender roles, that were occurring across Canada, as well as regional discontents like the Quiet Revolution, the explosion, no pun intended, of terrorist activity within Quebec and the French provinces of Canada, in the middle of this maelstrom with the movies themselves. So it was a social context that drew me to look at these films in Tax Shelter Terrors. But there's something else as well, Greg, that drew me to it. I mean, I've done a number of documentaries, and what I found is the following. I've looked at kind of Italian horror cultures during the period of the 70s. I've looked at sort of Italian and West German films in the 1970s and 1980s, and Canadian. And what you find is that when these cultures experience trauma or discontent, these kind of feel bad moments are filtered through genre cinema, right? And so Tax Shelter Terrors, you can really put all of these documentaries I've done together and they're telling the same story, right? And that story is that there's something quite challenging going on in society, whether it's Canadian society, Italian society, which had a similar wave of terrorism and gender concerns. West Germany, which had the Baader-Meinhof group, at the same time it had a wave of kind of, sort of exploitation and horror films. It's the same story being told, and so I think you can't look at these movies without looking at that crucial context. And that's what I'd say to the detractors of these films, is these films often told these challenging stories in a far more direct, political and dramatic way than so-called serious or art cinema. So they really deserve a place in the national cinema pantheon. And really what Tax Shelter Terrors did in a very humble way was trying to start or restart that discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, growing up, I had an uncle that owned a video store from 1981 to 1988, and I remember growing up, I was terrified of horror films. I didn't want anything to do with them. I remember every Friday night there was be a horror film on television, and I don't know whether it was me trying to face my fears. I always wanted to see good win over evil. I'm still kind of like that. I want to see good win over evil. But nonetheless, every Friday night there'd be a horror film on. I remember they played Salem's Lot. They played uh, Children Shouldn't Play It with Dead Things. They played um, Horror High, stuff like that. And they kind of stuck with me. And I would have nightmares over this. And I remember my cousins and my older brother had baited me into watching Friday the 13th Part 2. And that became the first time. I've told the story a million times, but I'll tell it again. It's the first time I've seen a naked female was when Kirsten Baker goes into the lake, and that was when my mom ran in and turned the television off. Forget that there was two or three grisly murders prior to that. No, it's a naked body. But I guess my older brother's argument with me was that, look, you watch Conan the Barbarian and the
Mm,
Beastmaster and look at the blood and gore in those, and I'm like, yeah, but Jason is not fighting Conan and
mm,
Beastmaster.
mm.
He's fighting a terrified female.
Yeah.
But he talked me into watching Friday the 13th, the final chapter one night, which I think it's the scariest of the Friday the 13th. And I've interviewed Ted White, who was Jason in that film, you know. And my brother's argument was uh, this has got a lot of stuff that's going to terrify you, but good wins over evil. And he was right. He was right. Corey Feldman kind of cemented that. But nonetheless, as much as I was watching behind my fingers, I got eased into it, and
Mm,
I've been kind of watching horror films ever since. And some of my favorites, like John Carpenter's Halloween, Bob Clark's Black Christmas, Brian De Palma's Dress to Kill, Abel Ferrara's Miss 45. Movies like that have greatly appealed to me. And there's a lot of films from Tax Shelter Terrors too. Also Canadian ones. Class of 1984 is one that's near and dear to me.
mm,
Yeah. But there's a lot of films that Tax Shelter Terror touches on. I have here on Blu-ray too. So, so I kind of got an interest in that, and your documentary there reminded me of my childhood at that time growing up. And it was kind of nice trip back in time. Now, a
mm,
lot of the titles stressed I didn't see at my uncle's video store. It would have been later on, when I was of age where I could have rented that stuff myself. But But nonetheless, I had a great time with it. So I'm so glad you were able to reach out to me, and do this. I found it funny you're from the UK and yet you're tackling the Canadian subject. And I was like, okay, okay, because I thought maybe you were based in Toronto or whatnot. But
No,
hey,
no, sorry to disappoint you. But as
you're
I
not
said,
disappointing me at all. I
no,
love coming on here and talking to somebody from the UK because I'm quite a few hours behind you, and of course it's your afternoon, it's my morning, and this is just perfect. I'm in New Brunswick, Canada, so I'm an hour ahead of East Coast time, so I'm in Atlantic Canada, so I'm 4 hours ahead of LA time,
yeah,
So nonetheless, this is great, and I like all kinds of horror films. I like Giallo.
yeah,
Um, I think I was one of the last to interview Daria Nicolodi. Um,
amazing,
I got
amazing.
her a few months before she passed. I had Dick Miller on 5 months before he passed. And a lot of times when people have passed away, I do tribute interviews.
Mm,
One that comes to mind greatly that I'm proud of is I've had the granddaughter of Alfred Hitchcock on here, which was amazing, and and Zoe Tamerlis Lunn's widow Robert come on 5 times, and I'm still in touch with him to talk about Zoe Tamerlis from Miss
amazing.
45.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
MS-45 is one of my all-time favorite films. And again, it's of that video generation. And I think, Greg, just listening to the films that terrified you, there's that common theme here. In a way, your older brother was right. Why don't you get Conan, but you're terrified of Friday the 13th Part Two? And I think the thing is, with the in genre films, you always get those moral question marks, don't you? Do you know what I mean? In Friday the 13th Part Two, the moral question marks are: Is Jason dead? Of course. What's happening there? What is the what's the legitimacy of Mrs. Voorhees, the dead mother? So there's all those question marks, and of course that incredible ending of MS-45 where she dies, the woman calls her sister, and then the dog reappears outside the landlady's apartment. So wonderful guests you've had and wonderful movies. And I go back to telling your viewers again, I think there's something, you can't ask for a more perfect vessel to reflect bad times than these horror movies. I
Oh,
mean, they
yeah.
are just such powerful vehicles for doing that, whether it's Giallo, Canadian horror. Right now, I'm starting work on a new documentary that's going to look at representations of rural communities in film. Why is that American society is so fascinated with and terrified by its own rural communities? And again, why, when American society is feeling very vulnerable, do they reappear in the most monstrous form, right? So it is the same story retold in different cloaks and
Mhm.
guises, but that's why I think horror remains such a powerful vehicle.
Yeah, Zoe went way too young, but I'm going to
Agreed.
tell you, her widow had I had him on here 5 times. So he those are very popular tribute interviews I did. I'm very proud of those. But he sent me some excerpts out of her diary, So I got the excerpts that have her handwriting, and um and he sent me some photos of her from her personal collection, I mean, they were just there, and he sent me some, and it was really cool to have that. Yeah, I discovered a lot of those films from Terror in the Isles. And that was where I discovered, Miss 45 and Dress to Kill, which is another favorite, and I love Brian De Palma.
Mm.
But nonetheless, it's interesting because my channel is not even a horror channel, although a lot of people call it that. I interview people from all walks of movies, but and different forms of entertainment. but nonetheless, your film took me back. And one of the things I thought was funny when I'm watching Tax Shelter Terror is and maybe I'm missing something here, but of course Porky's is not a horror film, but Porky's and Class of 1984, are they not part of the tax shelter?
Well, these are. I mean, we focused on "There's My Dog," so you've got your cat. There's my dog in the background. We focused on horror, but
Hmm.
the comedies, ribald comedies, were another part of the tax shelter system. So Porky's was another example of movies that Canadian,
You don't
effectively
consider
the
Porky's
Canadian, yeah.
horror?
No, no, I wouldn't. Well, again, you could say pork is horror. It's the horror of growing up, isn't it? The horror of not belonging. That's nicely put, actually.
Horror of
Yeah,
sticking
I'm
your
gonna have to
private
do.
areas someplace where you shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna have to do tax shelter terrors too now, just on porkies. But I think one of the key wraparounds for the documentaries, and I'm if memory serves me correctly, they did have some kind of link to these kind of rival Canadian comedies was the company Cinepix that features heavily in the documentary. Sort of headed up by um, Gunning and Link, the two entrepreneurs from Canada, and they weren't the only ones. I mean, the documentary profiles a number of creative entrepreneurs outside of John Dunning and Andre Link.
Hmm.
Pierre David being another of these. But they, Dunning and Link in particular, they were known as the Canadian Cormans because they were so able to tap the vein of what was going on, going from a very sort of humble basis, sort of film exhibitors, owning cinemas, and then distributing within Quebec racy films, and then creating their own racy film with Valerie that broke all box office records in Canada, and remained an unparalleled hit from 1967 when it was released up until the early 80s. But then they used that as a vehicle to just really go hammer and tongue with horror productions. So this is the company that introduced the world to David Cronenberg. This is the company that pioneered
Love
Canadian
Cronenberg.
home invasion films with Death Weekend. This is the company that were behind the controversy that was the Ilsa series, and this was the company that really pioneered Canada's own subgenre of slasher movies as well as comedies, right? So there's a whole history actually beyond the vein of what we mine in Touch Shelter Terrors, and that documentary really just looked at the 70s and 80s. The Quiet Revolution tried to come up to date and sort of look at what's happening in Canada right now, and looking more at the really fascinating emergence of women directors that have turned to horror in Canada, looking at the amazing Indigenous directors that have moved away from documentary into the genre. And one of the things we didn't do, and I kind of feel Greg is interested in, is starting to look at the Canadian regions, right? And so, I mean, I run Cine Excess. It's a film festival. It's been going for 18 years now. And because I love Canadian movies, I'm always on the lookout for
Oh,
Canadian
I
submissions. Just putting that out there to your viewers. We have a big space in our heart for Canadian submissions, so bear that in mind. But
actually I
I've
should ask
noticed,
you this. Sorry to interrupt, but I should ask you this. Porky's was the highest grossing film in Canada till Bon Cop, Bad Cop beat it out. Have you
yeah,
seen Bon Cop, Bad Cop?
I haven't, I'm afraid, no.
You gotta see it.
I'm gonna see it. I'm gonna
Yeah,
see it.
it's hilarious. It's a cop comedy. It's brilliant. Um, are you familiar with the Trailer Park Boys?
I am, yeah, yeah.
I love them. They've done three movies, and they've also have a movie called SwearNet, the movie, which broke the Guinness Book of World Records with the most F-bombs,
Okay.
935. Pretty funny. So
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
mature film.
yeah, yeah.
But nonetheless, Class of 1984 is a lot of people classify it as a thriller, not horror film, but I balance it on the two because I know, and especially the climax, it gets pretty horrific as the teacher is s- going through those dark, uh, darkly lit corridors trying to find his wife. And
Mm.
yeah. Um, but I did mention that. Now, Class of 1984, what are your thoughts on that? Was that a tax shelter film, or I was wondering why that wasn't part of the doc?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great film, and I've got a great deal of affection for it. And the only reason it's not in there, and again, it's nothing to do with conflicted roots. As you say, it's a film where, that seems to be, is it American, is it Canadian? It was literally because we were going on the basis of the talent we had available.
Okay.
And so, there were a number of films that didn't make that cut, and they remain amazing films. And Class of 1984 is one of them. And I think uh, maybe what makes it, is it a horror, is it a thriller, is it does have so-called respected mainstreamish actors in it, and that kind of makes its genre basis a bit more convoluted. But it's a really interesting film, and also it comes out at the tail end of the tax shelter era. Okay, when the Canadian government started thinking, I mean, there was controversy from the get go that the Canadian government was putting money into movies like Shivers, for instance,
I love
and
Shivers.
yeah, and what kind of image of Canada was that representing around the world? By the early 80s, the bubble had well and truly burst. The idea was that initially it was a sort of state funded scheme, and then it was a mixture of state and private capital coming together to kickstart the Canadian industry. And it really led to some people saying, well, really, we're just creating a cesspool of terrible genre movies. So effectively, the scheme was wound down. And, so those movies that appear in the 1980s they're fascinating because they're twilight of that scheme, not just Class of 84, as you mentioned, but a lot of the movies that William Fruitt, a wonderful Canadian director, was doing, seem to get lost in the mix. And they're really interesting and quite challenging films.
It's funny too because it's like I don't know because I'm not really pleased with where Canadian films is today. Here in New Brunswick, I'm definitely not impressed with it because I was talking to Jackie Giroux, filmmaker, and she was also in Drive-In Massacre, and she tried to make a film up here, and she succeeded, but she hated some of the politics involved in trying to make a film up here, and now she's going to Australia to make one, but she said making a film up here, especially in this province, was not exactly as thrilling as she'd hoped. Paul Lynch, the director of Prom Night, had a much more better time shooting Frozen Assets up here. But
Mm.
and I've had Paul Lynch on here 3 times. So
Wonderful. He's in the Quiet Revolution, as
I
you
know I
will have
saw him.
seen. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul. I remember he was asking us about our local newspaper, which I don't think is active anymore, or maybe it is. I don't know. I don't read newspaper here. I wouldn't even know if we had a holiday if my supervisor didn't tell me at the time. But but nonetheless, I've had Paul Lynch on here a number of times, and I love seeing the clips of a number of films on
Mm.
Tech Shelter Terror. I find it funny they're talking about the controversy. I'm like, you know what? We got David Cronenberg out of this.
Yeah.
It's like I want to look at these people and say, shut up. Can you do any better?
Mm.
It's like,
Mm.
and I love Cronenberg, and I do have Shivers here, autographed by Lynn Lowry, who was absolutely stunning in that. I got a few autographs from her in here and pictures, but but Shivers was interesting. Now, looking at Cronenberg's body of work, do you have a favorite film?
I mean, he's he remains a fascinating director, and it's a great question, Greg, because there's different stages of Cronenberg's career, different stages of him as a director. I would say I still I still have affection for the controversies that were Shivers and Rabid. I love the lyricism of something like Dead Ringers, which is such a melancholic film. So I sort of, and he's great. His recent works remain interesting and powerful, but I sort of go back to those earlier periods. I think there was something because it was like almost guerrilla filmmaking on the fly. Him working with those kind of maverick producers like Andre Lincoln and John Dunning. That there was something really magical there. Also, Pierre David, of course, which he worked with he was another tax shelter producer, who did great work with Cronenberg. And I think the thing is, why I'm interested by those early films is it was almost like an industrial kind of filmmaking. So your views may be interested, but if you go back to Cronenberg's early films, it's only when he starts working with Pierre David that you get a sense of Pierre David trying to create an auteur status around him, right? And so we automatically always assume it's always been there, but I think the earlier works with Cinepics like Rabid and initially Shivers are interesting for different reasons. They're much more edgy, avant-garde, guerrilla-like, and they're
Hmm.
interesting because he's not weighed down with his auteur status yet. All right, he's
Hmm.
part of almost like a creative collective, making these really controversial marginal movies.
Yeah, he made a lot of films that I really enjoyed, and you mentioned two of them. I love Scanners, I love The Brood, I love Videodrome. I think Videodrome was right there at the end of that tax shelter as well. And but I also like stuff he did later, like Trash, for
Mm,
example, was interesting. But his son is doing some great work, you know.
absolutely, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, and
Infinity Pool.
yeah,
Infinity
yeah.
Pool. I could watch Mia Goth be nuts all day.
Yeah, I mean, we've been fortunate. We've had Brandon Cronenberg join us via live stream for Cine Accept, and so he's really carrying that legacy forward. He's doing some great work, and again, like his father, there's something very un-Hollywood, very un-American about both father and son, which I think gives them that Canadian stamp. If you mentioned Paul Lynch and actually Paul Lynch, he's a British by birth and then went to work in Canada. But you look at his slasher films like Prime, they're not American slasher films any more than George Mahalka's My Bloody Valentine is. It's no way that's an American slash. That's more like that could be a drama documentary on mining communities with a mass killer thrown in, if that makes sense. I mean, so there's something really, it's like the national identity seeps through these genre texts. And that's really why they need, talking about and memorializing.
I've had Ali Newty on from My Bloody Valentine on here twice. I love her, she is so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Great movie.
Yep, I've got that here too. Not signed by anybody yet, but I'm hoping because Ellie Newty was in one of the horror-ramas that before I started going. But I would love to meet her. But I've had her on the show here a couple times, so she's been wonderful. I love her accent too. But nonetheless, yeah, it was like going back in time with some of these films. So a tax shelter terror. Was there any particular film that sparked uh, making this documentary?
I think it happened over, had a Canadian colleague called Deke Richards, and Deke and I actually met at Sitges, the festival in Spain, and we just happened to walk past each other, and he said it started talking to him. He said, "Oh, you're the guy who wrote that book, Shocking Cinema of the '70s." I said, "Yeah, I was there with another documentary at the time." And he said he loves '70s films. So we really just ensconced ourselves in this library of great Canadian work. So there wasn't one. I mean, we were aware that we needed to deal with the masters like Cronenberg, so that was a given, and we wanted to do justice to that. But we also really wanted to sort of highlight those great Canadian talents that hadn't got the sort of coverage they deserve. So go back to someone like William Fruitt, who's an incredible director. I remember seeing Death Weekend on back to Betamax. Video Media, I think, was the company, and it had a really chilling cover. It was a black and white image of the heroine just looking in peril on the back, and it really, oh God, that's really quite terrifying. So it was movies like the Death Weekends that we wanted to put on the documentary to give them coverage, and then there were movies that we were going, my God, I didn't know that was Canadian, like the Ilsa theories, because Gunning and Link concealed the national identity markers until the last movie, which was outwardly set in Canada. Apparently, we were fortunate because Cinepix, the estate, they're no longer going as a film company, of course, after John Dunning's death, but the estate still has archives. So we're looking for the archive material. They even intended before Bruce Lee's death to do like a Ilsa meets Bruce Lee hybrid. Can you believe?
Oh,
So that
wow.
would have been such an amazing movie if that had been made. So sorry if that's a long answer, but it was about putting on the plate those movies that the public needed to be aware of, as well as celebrating the masters like David Cronenberg. And if you get slasher movies with disco scenes in like Prom Night, that's even better.
Yeah. I've tried to find contact info for William Fruitt, but I haven't been able to because he also directed Funeral Home, and I've had Leslie Donaldson on here a couple
And
times. And
Spasms. And he also directed a really interesting Deliverance redux. We knew it as Trapped, but I think you might have known it as Baker County, USA. And Williams really dismissive of that film, but I think it's really interesting because it's Deliverance told through a powerful female protagonist within a rural community, acts as a moral counterpoint to Henry Silver, who's just Henry Silver, basically mad and dangerous. So across his body of work, there's fascinating stuff there. And we'll have to talk and see if we can get William Fruitt on your show, because he's such an amazing filmmaker. He needs, really putting on the pinnacle he deserves. Let's not forget as well, he started off with a very powerful film, Wedding in White, which was a domestic drama, Donald Pleasance. So he's got real heritage there in his film back catalogue.
yeah, and let's not forget Ivan Reitman, who, of course,
Of course.
had the cannibal comedy there. And look where he went. I mean, Ghostbusters, and and I mean, Ghostbusters is still celebrated today. And of course, he's done a variety of other films as well. And Reitman, sadly, we lost not too long ago. Um, but I find it funny how they scrapped the tax shelter, but look at the talent that we got out of that we could still be getting today had they not
You're
been
so
so
right.
ignorant.
Yeah, you're so right. And in a way, they, you know, what I would say to those people who still look back and say this was a very, unpalatable, ignoble period of Canadian societies, every or most cultures during this period had a comparator of the tax shelter scheme, which was government incentives to try and create a national cinema culture that looked and felt a bit different to Hollywood. But the fascinating thing is not really any of these cultures produce quality films in mass. Largely, the most interesting were the genre productions. So there was nothing specific about Canada to single these films out for kind of, you know, the level of controversy and sort of press bound hatred they received. And it's such a shame that that funding did go. What we did in The Quiet Revolution, which is the follow-up documentary to Tax
Mhm.
Shelter Terrors, we did look at then what happened funding wise once the tax shelter went. And one of the interesting things, of course, is there were educational incentives that emerged. So we look at the fact that um, there were certain Canadian film schools that emerged that were hothouse talent, you know, so that's been one outlet for talent. And right now, you mentioned what's going on in your region and production and the challenges for production. I think one of the fascinating things bringing the story right up to date is just territory by territory. What's happening and how are people finding capital investment, opportunity to create genre films? So going back to Cine Excess, we're finding loads and loads of films from Vancouver. There's like a real Vancouver horror scene. I'm sure there's others out there that we're not receiving here in the UK. So I would urge Canadian filmmakers who do horror and cult, you know, do check out Cine Excess. If you're looking to submit anyway, you'd find a very sympathetic home to what you're doing.
Yeah, I don't know what they were expecting for like I'm sorry, I know there's big successful dramas and stuff like that out there, but would they have been celebrated here in Canada as a tax shelter? I don't think so, unless there's something significant. No, I don't think so. Um, so they can voice their ignorance all they want to. The fact of the matter is, David Cronenberg and William Fruit and Ivan Reitman and directors like that, Paul Lynch, they put a lot of spotlight on Canada,
Yeah.
so there you go. But nonetheless, I did want to mention this because this film I was not in the documentary either, but Black Christmas was that tax shelter.
It's interesting. I don't know if that was tax. I actually think it was. It was, or it would have been maybe the Canadian Film Development Corporation (CFDC) was started in the early 1970s. And when we talk about tax shelter, often it's conflating two schemes together.
Hmm.
There was an initial government subsidy where you could get funding for a film that had a definable Canadian elements, whether it was Canadian storyline, cast, or crew. You could get money for that. That provided an initial wave of support for not only genre films but for more quite respectable Canadian film. It was replaced in around the mid 1970s with the Capital Cost Allowance Act that became known as the tax shelter. And that was basically offering tax incentives for wealthy Canadian individuals to invest in Canadian production. So when we talk about the tax shelter, if that makes sense, they're two sort of schemes that sort of merged into one. I'm pretty sure off the top of my head there was either capital cost allowance money or tax shelter money that went into Black Christmas. Either way, what can't be denied is its status as a seminal Canadian slasher movie. And again, going back to that distinction, it doesn't feel like an American slasher movie, right? In a number of ways, it's a very character driven. It's focused around female discourse and female talk for a lot of it. You have, rather than the maskless killer, you have the maniacal voice of the killer. So there's a kind of genre deviation there. And of course, the open ending as well. So it really was a trailblazer. But again, sort of didn't get the coverage it deserved, which is really interesting. And again, you said for every film in Tax Shelter Terrors, there's a bundle of films we didn't get in there. We got Black Christmas in there, Bob Clark, but look at some of the earlier films he was doing.
Yeah.
And they're not in there. So this is just like a statement of intent, this documentary, and it's for other researchers, filmmakers to come along and start building up the catalogue around those films, which really needs to be done.
What was interesting watching A Quiet Revolution, uh, you did move up into what's going on now because Ginger Snaps got mentioned in there. And I remember seeing that in the movie theater, which was an interesting take on a werewolf movie, involved the whole thing about took the werewolf theme and stationed it around the whole idea of women on their periods.
Mm.
And that was very interesting take on the werewolf subgenre, Um, talk about what led to A Quiet Revolution, what made you continue the story?
Well, what led to it first of all was there was kind of interest in the first film, Tax Shelter Terrors. But again, there was also a feeling that maybe it kind of done what it could do. Okay, number one, and we wanted to, working with different creators and different producers and different funders, we wanted to update the story. And that's why we did the Quiet Revolution. So the Quiet Revolution was specifically um, targeted towards the Susker Sisters remake of Rabid. So a UK distributor who provided the funding and support for the Quiet Revolution had the rights for the Susker Sisters remake of Rabid. So initially they wanted two documentaries, which are why you're saying part one and part two, in case that's not doesn't make sense to your viewers. So part one was that they'd acquired the rights to the original Cronenberg Rabid that they were putting out, and they'd also had the rights for the Susker Sisters remake of Rabid. So part one was on was a revision of the Tax Shelter Terrorist doc. It went into more detail, covered more movies, and then part two was for the new generation of filmmakers looking at the Susker Sisters, and beyond. And Ginger Snaps fits perfectly in. It's a transitional movie. It comes after the tax shelter period when filmmakers are trying to figure out where do we go next, what funding streams can we use. Ginger Snaps had so many creatives attached to it. John Fawcett as director, but also Steve Hoban as producer. Vincenzo Natali did the storyboards. And it introduced the world to some great Canadian actresses who had real power and genre standing. The Soska sisters rightfully say it was a really pivotal text for them when they were grown up. So that was the motivation behind the Quiet Revolution, was to sort of bring the story up to date, but also to start dealing with some of the new voices in the field. As I say, an explosion of women directors moving into the genre, a really fascinating explosion of indigenous filmmakers moving into the genre, what we call diaspora filmmakers, people from another culture who now live in Canada. Gigi Sol Guerrero, right, just being one example of that. That trend that was also covered in the documentary, and very much going back to your earlier point, Greg, as many of the filmmakers that are in there, heck, there's a bundle who didn't make the cut, and that's why I kind of feel more needs to be done. You
Sure.
mentioned 100 cult movies that came out in 2011 as a book, and Ernest and I have just done the second edition. I don't think people know about that, so that's actually a spoiler that the second edition of 100 cult movies is coming out later this year. And in the
Okay.
forward to that book, we've said if God puts breath in our body and the publisher allows that breath to go from body to page, we'll look forward to seeing you all for the final cut, the third of the trilogy, in another 10 years. And I raise that because I kind of feel there needs to be another documentary now, specifically looking at Indigenous Canadian horror. Does that make
Okay.
sense? So you've got that's where I would, if I ever got the chance to do another, or funding to do another, that's the really fascinating story yet to be told.
Yeah. I find that greatly fascinating, and I love the update with the Quiet Revolution as well. I noticed and maybe this is personal because with David Cronenberg just before the pandemic. Um, of course, the convention got canceled due to the pandemic. They finally got David Cronenberg signed. I think it was Texas Frightmare or something like that. And I was nowhere near there to see him, but and maybe it's because it's been a while since I've seen Tax Shelter, but I don't recall Cronenberg even being interviewed. Have you guys had problems getting him on camera?
I think it was just, again, it's a valid point. I mean, I've been honoured to interview David Cronenberg a couple of times, mainly in print form. So I interviewed him when Existence was in post production.
I love
Then
that
did
film, saw it in
Yeah,
theater.
yeah. Then I did another sort of interview in a kind of communal setting with him. So we we put out the call for people to be involved, and often people are they're just they're doing other things, or they're in other spaces. So it was a case of who would passionately want to do it, and we interviewed those people that passionately wanted to do it. We'd love the fact in the future, if there was ever a third edition of the documentary, um, that David Cronenberg would be in there. Because if you think about it, one of the earliest representations of Indigenous figures in Canadian horror is the police scene in the original Rabid, where Indigenous figures are being manhandled by the cops. So there's some really subtle references into that story there. So who knows in the future, that could well happen, but we're going to be guided by the filmmakers that are out there and what they're doing, and that will guide if there's ever the funding or an opportunity to do an update of Tax Shelter Terrors and the Quiet Revolution, a third one, what we'd call it.
Yeah, and like with William Fruit, I haven't had the Sasha sisters on here yet either. Although I have had a set of twins on here, though. I had the twin girls you see at the beginning of Single White Female, the Materas twins. So I have had a set of twins on there. They're mirror twins,
Oh,
Materas
right.
twins.
Okay.
Yeah, they're mirror twins, so they were interesting. But I got to get the Sasha's sisters on here because American Mary and all those wonderful things. Now I've met Laura Vandervoort from the Rabbit, their version
Rabid.
of Rabbit, yeah. And I'm going to tell you, it was one of the few times I was nervous meeting somebody. It was at Frightmare in the Falls because she was so stunningly hot. I was almost afraid to approach her, Uh, but nonetheless, I did. And I sweat a lot, I think, but but nonetheless, I do look forward to the third installment, and I think it's fascinating that you tackled the subject. And I've never been to the UK before. I've interviewed a lot of people from the UK. Um, what Canadian films seem to be popular there?
That's a really interesting question. I think the classics are always going to be popular, and those are films like the Cronenberg movies, or there's a big love and affection for those Canadian slasher films. I think they're probably seen as exotic slashers. Weirdly, they're slashers that aren't quite right, or they don't fit a standard template, American template. So that's why they're loved. Everyone loves the Soska sisters here in the UK. So we had them over for Cine Excess uh, back in 2019, before the pandemic hit, and it was like they were mobbed, by fans wherever and there was such real emotion and intensity. So we were big fans of the Soska sisters here, and are very selfless, as well as being very talented. They're very selfless. They always come and talk to our students, our film students, and they offer them advice. So, we, yeah, you've got to get them on your show. But in terms of Canadian genre film, there's a fascination by the new stuff, but also reverence and love for the old stuff. The Cronenbergs, the William Fruit, and those atypical slashers, those brilliant atypical slashers that came out of Canada.
Yeah, I noticed on Wikipedia and just last year, I did not realize that Infinity Pool. I know it was done by Brandon Cronenberg, but I didn't realize it was a Canadian film.
Mm,
So often I think, oh, they must have done this in the US or whatever, I did not realize that. So
mm.
fascinating. So, and they're starting to catch on with a lot of interesting talent as well, but nonetheless, and it doesn't matter how many times, they say Mean Girls is American film. I still see Canada every time I watch that film. So it doesn't matter. But nonetheless, after Revolution, are you Quiet Revolutions, are you working on your third installment, or do you have something else cooking right now?
Yeah, got something cooking right now. I mentioned it earlier briefly. I mean, I would love, to do a follow-up on. I'd do it specifically on Indigenous Canadian
Mhm.
horror, and I'd be very passionate to do that. Funding's not there yet, but I really would take that project forward given the opportunity. Right now, I'm working on this documentary. It's at the very early stages on American rural communities and horror, and why American cinema is fascinated by that. So that's probably going to take me um, up until next year. We're just starting out now, trying to get the film crews together, and looking potentially at a Los Angeles shoot or an Austin shoot. But who knows? The film crew might pop up at one of these great Canadian conventions to interview talent as well.
Now, have you ever met Uwe Boll? Because I know he's a German filmmaker who, for a long time, lived in Canada. I've had him on here 3 times, and reg- for the rep he's got, I got to admit, I loved the movie Postal. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was hilarious, but he gets attacked a lot as being a bad filmmaker, but I don't know. I loved Postal, and I had him on here, and had a great time with him. And I know he's moved back to Germany now, but even he was doing the tax thing just through Germany.
Mm.
Have you ever had any dealings with him?
Never had any dealings with him, and I know of his films, of course, and I think one of the reasons why filmmakers like that get attacked is, okay, so not everyone likes their films, right? That's a given. But also, it's like they're filmmakers who don't belong, so that he's come out of a German context where he has a different reputation and he's moved across cultures and moved into genre, right? And that is where the mismatch begins. Another director who had that reputation was Romano Scavolini, who became infamous for his film Nightmares, also known as, sorry, there's my dog again, Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. So he's another, quotes, Italian art director, moved into genre, moved to the States, and so it's about a rightly or wrongly perception of where these filmmakers belong and the filmmaking cultures in which they belong.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I haven't seen any Uwe horror movies, but I've seen Postal and Blubberella, and I have to say I got a I got a chuckle out of them. And I've interviewed, like I said, I had him on. I've interviewed several people from those particular 2 films. Um, but nonetheless, no, it was wonderful having you come on here and talk about this today. But we need to talk about the 100 cult films book, which had Divine on the cover from Pink Flamingos. Um, I'll tell you, I've met Mink Stoll at Horrorama 2017. Never had her on here. Couldn't seem to get her to respond to me. However, I remember when I say when somebody's passed away, I do tribute interviews. I reached out and I got Cookie Mueller's son Max on here, and it is one of my most listened to interviews, whether it be on YouTube or Spotify. People are fascinated with Cookie Mueller. I'm going to tell you a little story that he shared with me that I don't know whether you're aware of, but it's fascinating trivia. Max told me that he is one of the babies that's um, sold to they were doing that thing where they were pregnanting the female and then they were selling the babies off. Well, Max is one of the babies that they sell off. And so he's in that film. He said it's kind of weird seeing his mom being sexually assaulted by a chicken. But he takes it all tongue in cheek because he's like calls John Waters Uncle John. But I had her son on talking about Cookie Mueller, which was fascinating. But but I'm glad you're going to do another one. That is a purchase I have to make, and because I love cult films. Um, I know that expands past Canada, so I need to ask what some of your favorite cult films are.
Oh gosh. My all-time favorite film is still the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Going back to watching it on Betamax as a teenager, and I love Canadian stuff. I love Giallo. I love some of the contemporary stuff that's coming out. I do like comedies as well. So, all I would say as a final teaser is the second 100 cult films will have some of those cult classics in, but it's going to try and bring the story up to date a bit more and look at all of the new generation of filmmaking talent that's moved into cult and why they're significant and why we should be championing those. So watch this space.
You mentioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I have interviewed a few people from that film. Terry McMinn, the meat hook victim's been on here twice. John Dugan, whose grandpa was on here, and I met him at Frightmare in the Falls. Alan Denzinger has been on here a couple times. I met him at Frightmare in the Falls. Ed Gwynn, the truck driver, has been on here. Um, and I met Edwin Neal, and William Vale, both at Frightmare. I haven't had them on here yet, but I have covered the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre quite well on here, and it's quite an interesting movie. But nonetheless, I got a few signatures on that. Terry McMinn was not at Frightmare in the Falls, but luckily I've got a couple autographs of her through the mail, so it's great to make that connection because, of course, she was the iconic meat hook victim. Now, I started this podcast in 2015, so I was a little late getting Gunnar Hansen or Marilyn Burns on here. Maybe I could do a tribute on them. Who knows? But nonetheless, great choice on there. Um, I don't know what my favorite cult film is. I know Miss 45 is a big fascination with me. And you mentioned Giallo. I like a lot of the Argento movies, like Suspiria and Deep Red. I like De Palma, like Dress to Kill is a big favorite of mine. Um, and Sisters and stuff like that. Um, and even the Cronenberg stuff. I like people who are innovative, like really innovative. I'll tell you something that you might want to look into for the book. Um, was something I just discovered within the last year. Was a little film called Dead Dicks.
Don't know that one
Okay,
at all.
okay. I interviewed one of the actresses from it. I was in a record store that had some Blu-rays, and the cover caught my eye. It was a nice bright Blu-ray cover. And I went up to the counter and I said hello to the person, because somebody that works there a lot knows who I am. And I said, you got a Blu-ray back there called Dead Dicks. And they said, yeah. I said, we're having a hard time keeping it in. We've sold like 4 copies of it. I was like, really? I went up to my car and I was about to leave to go to work or whatnot. And I was like, that thing's gnawing at me. So I went back in and I purchased it without even hadn't seen it. I brought home, and what a fascinating film. It's definitely uh, uh, be right up your alley. But what it is, it's called Dead Dicks because the title character's name is Richard. And beginning of the film opens up, you you see what looks like a dead body, and then you see another person coming into frame, but you don't see his identity. And the person hangs himself or kills himself in some way, and that goes to the credits. Now, I interviewed the bartender in this, and uh, her coworker was the sister of the victim at the beginning, person that committed suicide. Anyway, the woman she works with is getting a phone call, a frantic message from her brother because she's concerned because of her brother's mental health.
Hmm.
She goes to his apartment frantically because she knows that this is emergency. She goes there and she gets into his apartment and she's looking for him and looking for him, can't find him. She looks in the closet and finds him dead. And she starts breaking down and breaking down. Suddenly, a figure comes in behind her and says her name, and she like screeches. There's her brother there, naked, eating cereal. And she's like confused. And he says, I called you here because I need you to witness this. Every time I die, I keep coming back to life. And so there's actually a vagina on one of the walls, which comes into play towards the end of it, which I won't give away. But it, it becomes a horror comedy
Hmm.
because he is trying to figure out what has happened that he keeps coming back to life. And at one point, he tried different ways to kill himself, and he wants to drown himself in the bathtub with a toaster, and he says to her, he says, after he's come back to life, he looks at the toaster and says, "Does this thing still work?"
So I
It,
haven't seen it. I haven't seen it, Greg, but it reminds me just before I head off for my next appointment. It's been first of all, it's been great to chat. So thank you for having
Mhm.
me on. John dies at the end. Have you seen John dies at the end?
I haven't, but I know what one you're talking about.
Don
I
Cascarelli, I believe, isn't it? Yeah,
I need to look into that because I know exactly which one you're talking about. But
yeah.
yeah,
And
Dead
it's
Dip.
just that loop, and again, these why these films are so fascinating is because they're either playing with narrative or they're playing with the culture that's created them. But I've just been while I've been talking, I've been scribbling loads of notes, and it's another interesting film, So it's been amazing to sort of sit and chat with you, and
And
thank you for having me on.
you should see Bon Cop Bad Cop too because
I'm
it's
definitely going to check that out. I'm definitely
yeah.
going to check that
That
out.
one there involves 2 cops from 2 different jurisdictions. There's a body that falls from, I don't know whether it's thrown from a plane or whatnot, but it is stuck on the top of a sign. So one half of the body is in the States and the other half's in Canada.
Yeah,
So
interest. That's a brilliant metaphor for these films, isn't it? You know, one's parts in America and the other's in Canada. How apt is that? Brilliant.
yeah, absolutely,
Thank,
absolutely. It was great having you come on here today and talk about this with me, And I definitely have got to you got to keep me updated on the 100 is it going to contain the ones from the first book as well?
no, entirely new entries, 100 new entries. And
Okay.
we end with a subsection we're calling Newly Stubborn. And I'm not going to spoil it, but Newly Stubborn is two new films that are stubborn because they look back to past cult film traditions, but certainly have their eyes forward. So you'll have to, I'll certainly let you and your viewers know when that book is published.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely. Well, before I let you go, would you mind doing a plug for my show?
Absolutely. I've had a great time on Greg's show, and I've been talking about tax shelter terrorism, cult movies in general, and why they matter, and why Canadian cult films matter. So check it out on Greg's show, and thank you once again for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have yourself a wonderful day there in the UK, and I am going to get this done up, and like I said, when it's ready, I'll send it to you, and you can put it up wherever you want to.
Thank you, Greg.
All right, keep fighting the good fight, and when your next book is ready and your next film is ready, I'd love to have you back on.
Will do. Thanks once again.
All right, God bless you. You take care.